And I was intrigued to do this by Costas's, one of the questions he asked in his call for papers, which was to think of Palamas in light of AI and the AI revolution and the question of transhumanization, etc. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm talking from that end. This will not be a detailed historical presentation of Palamas. As a matter of fact, I'm on the other end of the table. I'm on the side of, I want to present the arguments for AI, what it says about the crisis of any kind of crisis in our thinking or experience, and then challenge you to continue to develop the Palamite tradition to answer these questions. You should be inspired, I think, a little bit. I wonder how you think of this, by the work of Pope Leo XIV in his Magnificat Humanitas. Because what he does in that long document, if you haven't had a chance to see it, is he goes back to the foundation of modern Catholic social teaching, which is 1891 and the publication of Rerum Novarum by his predecessor, Leo XIII, which he discusses questions of society in light of the new economic models, in light of tensions on the working classes and new changes in the nature of work that were confronting people, and he lays down certain principles. So Leo XIV goes back to that document and then rather exhaustively summarizes the next all of the documents of popes that have anything to do with these social questions. That's a good part of what he does. And then he applies this and extracts principles. And this is what I'd like to underline for you. Principles of Catholic social teaching, moral and theological principles. And then in the end, he really spends relatively little time applying them to AI. He doesn't claim to be an expert about AI or anything. He doesn't make the mistake that I think his predecessor made by buying into one view, what I'm talking about, Laudato Si by Francis, in which he buys into a certain science of climate change that he does so very uncritically. Leo is more cautious and just says, how do we apply? Here's the questions that AI raises. What do we have to say in light of these values that have come out of our teaching in the last 100 years? So it seems to me that is a challenge to Orthodox thinkers to do something similar in grappling with what is truly a crisis, or at least it's being presented in that way. And let me go to that end of the thing now and say, in speaking about the AI question, I think there's something that's fundamental to it. It's not merely a question of changes in the workplace. It's not the difference between a calculator and an abacus. There's an implication that there's something far more radical taking place. And really, that we're at a turning point in history, or even a turning point in human nature. And I would like to suggest that, especially in light of Palamas, that this is really one thing that is very much present in the current debate, which we haven't spoke about yet tonight, is the apocalyptic tradition in Christianity. And at any meeting on Palamas, you're going to hear about this otherwise obscure Calabrian named Varlam. But there's another Calabrian monk who had a much greater influence on the whole Middle Ages, and that is none other than Joachim of Fiore, who is the most important figure in the apocalyptic tradition in the Middle Ages, and whose thought echoes far and wide, I think, even up to the present, in the way in which people have this view of AI as transformational. So let me suggest that in one way. Remember that Joachim lives, a little more about Joachim if he's not familiar to you. He's a Calabrian monk. He starts his own congregation of monks. And he is someone who claims to be given a vision of the future, and is famous for his division of dispensations into three dispensations. The first being the age of the Father, the second being the age of the Son, and the third being the age of the Holy Spirit. And this third thing is quite different from something that Augustine, for instance, did in talking about the end times. Because for Augustine, the end times were a continuation of the complex relationship between the world and the church, which he does in Civitatis Dei so well, that it is not a simple matter of the church being all good and pure and the world being all polluted and lacking virtue. There's this much more difficult to understand but constant interaction between the two realms that carries on into the end when Christ comes to judge the living and the dead. Well, for the prophet of Calabria, Joachim, he thinks something quite different, that in this third age or the third status, there will be new revelations that will come forth to the church and to the world. And let's just compare that to what Augustine says a little more carefully. Augustine, who writes at the beginning of the Middle Ages, remember that Joachim dies about a century and a half before Palamas in 1202. When you compare what Augustine says about the millennium of Revelation 20, he says this is to be read allegorically, already inaugurated with Christ in the church, so that any total separation of good from evil only comes at the very end of time, at God's unknowable moment. Humanity lives in the seculum, where the signs of the end are not readable, and millennial peace is heavenly, not terrestrial. Joachim is the most creative medieval apocalyptic historicist, as seen in his break with Augustine. He divides history into the three ages, as we said, and anticipates an earthly third stage or status, or third age, when the church's structures will be radically transformed and perfected before the final judgment. It's a future historic stage, not merely a celestial allegory. It is fundamentally apocalyptic. The church age is exhausted. A new age is breaking out, and the signs are there for the wise to see. Augustine, by contrast, has talked about a present state of imperfection, where the city of God and the city of man are locked in an interdependence. It would be that way until the very end. Only at the last judgment would we see the end of history. There would be no new movement, no new moment in history in which there would be perfect peace. That would only happen at the end, at God's inscrutable hour. Joachim, by contrast, is, as I said, an apocalyptic historicist. He divides history into the three ages and claims that in this third age, the church's structure will be radically transformed and perfected before the last judgment. These traditions have enormous impact on the world, and one way in which that and in modernity, because as we end the Middle Ages and begin the new a new age, quite literally, in the world's history, that is inaugurated by Columbus's discovery of the Americas. And guess what Columbus does after his fourth voyage? He issues a book that he calls, a writing he calls the Book of Prophecies, in which he says, my founding of America is the beginning of the third age prophesied by Joachim of Fiore. And he's not alone. The spiritual Franciscans that follow are very effective means for spreading this. Dante, if you're a Dante scholar, you can't understand paradise without understanding Joachim of Fiore. Because remember in the first chapter of Paradiso, that Dante, the pilgrim, is looking at Beatrice's eyes and she's looking up into heaven. And as he gazes into her eyes that are reflecting the glories of heaven, he says, I found myself being transhumanized. He actually makes up a new word. And he said, and he compares himself to Glaucon in the Metamorphosis of Ovid, being changed as he partook of a new food. And he says then, I cannot explain more, after he creates this new word, transhumanize. I cannot explain more. Let per verba, with words, but this will have to suffice until you have the experience yourself. So this wing of Christianity, the apocalyptic tradition, lives on. And in America, it goes against the Augustinian tradition, which is really where the pilgrims, the English Puritans, are grounded very much. But it's manifest. And I think it's very much manifest in 20th century and certainly before that, discussions of evolution. I mean, speaking of evolution here, not as a scientific theory, but as really a kind of social imaginary, which is the way I'm speaking about apocalypticism as well here. This is not a philosophical analysis. But if you look at what happens in the 20th century that I think prepares us for this current discussion of transhumanism in light of AI, is a couple of things. We have an essay done in 1957 by Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley is not to be confused with his relative Aldous Huxley, the author, the better known of the Huxleys, who's the guy that writes Brave New World. This is Julian, who writes Transhumanism in 1957. He also goes on to be the first director of UNESCO. So he's a big internationalist, a scientist of some minor repute, but a humanist and an internationalist more than anything. His view of transhumanism, I mean, he uses this word and in his essay and says that he begins with the observation that evolution is a fact and includes human nature. It is as if this man has been suddenly tapped for a new job to run a corporation, to run a big enterprise, and he doesn't know how to do it. And he says, so it's a moment in our history where our consciousness must change, must evolve. And this full realization of the individual and the power of the human intellect and essence has to be what is predominant in this new world. So it's this very, positive, optimistic, some would say naively so, vision of transhumanism that plays such a role in the 50s. We can also talk about a couple of other people very quickly. And that is, one is Teilhard de Chardin, or Teilhard, who's was a serious scientist involved very much with Peking Man and those expeditions, a member of the French Academy of Science, but a Jesuit who wrote like a poet and had this vision of evolution as being totally compatible with God's revelation, and that all is involved in moving toward the omega point. And he discusses this concept of what he calls cosmogenesis, that the process of creation is going on. And he then theologizes that by saying that what we're seeing is all things moving toward the omega point. That is the self-developed complexity. It also represents Christ, who is Alpha and Omega. So Teilhard, of course, was silenced by Rome, and he couldn't publish his works on theology for the last 20 years of his life or more. But now he's a darling. Again, Pope Francis quoted him in Laudato Si. A couple of other responses to this question of transhumanism. Another guy that gets quoted by Pope Leo XIV in his new encyclical is Romano Guardini, who was an Italian who worked in German universities. And he writes a famous meditation on the new technologies called Letters from Lake Como in 1934, which is a bit of an idol, Adyle, Adyle. It's because it presents this very idyllic picture of the world before technology. So he's critical of technology, but he doesn't. But he ends on a positive note of saying what we need to do is accommodate it and use the best of our traditions to accommodate it. Lastly, there's the Protestant response from the Swiss philosopher and theologian Jacques Ellul, who writes his famous La Technique in 1954. And this is a critical analysis of the impact on society of technology, which he says represents a total dedication to the method of ultimate and continuing efficiencies at every level. So this sort of thing goes on. And I think it's behind so much of what we're doing and talking about AI now. I mean, it's not really a question of whether or not you should buy the initial public offering of Anthropic, which you probably should, but that's another question. Remember the last time I was there, one of the young Romanian students wanted me to buy Bitcoin. And I said, no, that was a mistake. But the question is, how much of this that we're facing now is just a continuation of the apocalyptic mentality with its dreams and hopes and exaggerations? Or is there something more profound about to happen? And then most importantly, what is the religious response of orthodoxy? And it's not going to do to just talk about essences and energies. So I sort of wish to leave you with that challenge. What is there in the Orthodox tradition that can respond to this, that might be different from the apocalyptic tradition, that might be therefore a more apt or at least a distinct response to the moral and philosophical questions and challenges of the new world of AI that we're all living in now? Thank you.